Undoubtedly, the most difficult part about being a tech reviewer or tech YouTuber is that time is almost always against you, particularly with products that get frequent refreshes like the iPhone 14 Pro for example. When it first came out, every YouTuber was rushing to make a quality review because that's when it matters the most. That's when people are most likely to buy the latest iPhone, so having a review helps. With that said though, we don't nearly have all the exposure we need with that phone to make a conclusive review, which of course makes sense. So several months later, after using the iPhone 14 Pro as a daily driver, this is a far more practical and realistic review of how my experience with the iPhone 14 Pro has been. Now, to be perfectly clear, I'm not going to bore you with all the details all over again about the iPhone 14 Pro that's been said 100 times. Rather, I'm going to tell you what works for this phone and what doesn't, and ultimately help you determine if this is still a good phone to consider going into 2023. So let's get started. Design-wise, the fact is, the iPhone 14 Pro looks and feels very familiar to that of the iPhone 12 and 13 series of phones. You're not going to get a whole lot of change here. However, one area that often goes understated is the display. A lot of new additions were made. For example, thanks to the ability to now have a 1 Hz refresh rate, always on displays were finally possible on the iPhone 14 Pro. That basically means that stuff like complications could now be on your lock screen. And look, a lot of people hated the initial iteration of the always on display with the iPhone, but I don't get what all the hate was about. I love having my wallpaper in a dimmed down state as my always on display. It adds so much more personality rather than a generic black screen with a couple of widgets on there. Now, of course, with that said, it's not everyone's cup of tea, and Apple has finally added the ability to turn off the wallpaper entirely and just show the widgets themselves, which changes things around for people and brings it more with the norm of the industry standard. Of course, the other side of this was that the current version of the always on display isn't nearly as efficient as some of the competitors, and there are still battery drain issues despite the ability to turn off the wallpaper. We'll talk about battery management a little bit later on in the video. I said it when it first came out and I'll say it again. The dynamic island is one of the most impressive features of the iPhone 14 Pro. Yes, from one perspective, it's just pretty makeup to hide the notch on the iPhone 14 Pro or make something more meaningful out of it, but it's the execution that Apple delivers with it that makes it so phenomenal. So it's the little things. For example, my wife frequently takes pictures from my phone, or sometimes she'll want to transfer information from my phone to her own phone or her MacBook, and I frequently use AirDrop as a result of this. Now, often these files are very large in size and the AirDrop can take well over a minute. Now, in this case, I can conveniently keep on using my phone, and you'll notice that the AirDrop status quickly just goes to the very top of the dynamic island. It gives me just enough information to know that the AirDrop is still happening, and so I make sure that she stays in close proximity for a fast transfer. I use this all the time. Or another great example is sometimes YouTube is playing in the background and my full volume is at 0. Now, I don't really pay attention to it, but those waveforms at the top of the dynamic island tell me something is playing, and simply expanding the dynamic island allows me to pause the media directly. It's these little series of actions that I run into on my day-to-day life that make the dynamic island so useful. I really think it still has a long way to go in terms of its true potential, but it's a fantastic feature, and really all the mockery is unnecessary because it does make a difference. The final thing I will say about the display is that 2000 nits of peak brightness is absolutely friggin' insane. This thing is trying to compete with the sun in terms of luminosity. It's crazy. And I also love that Apple's auto brightness feature is so well refined that I seldomly need to go and manually adjust brightness, and it does great across all environments. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on performance. The fact is that if you have an iPhone that's less than 3 generations old, absolutely nothing will change for you in terms of overall usage. So opening Instagram or browsing Safari is just going to feel as fast as it would on an iPhone 12 Pro. There's going to be no real benefit unless you're otherwise using extreme apps that really do push the processor to its limit. The only way you're going to be able to justify your purchase is by running Geekbench scores and seeing higher numbers, which again will make no real difference difference in your day-to-day life, do not use Geekbench scores as an indicator for whether or not you get an iPhone 14 Pro. There are far more tangible things you can consider. The cameras, another area which is given far too much significance when upgrading a phone. Here's the problem. 95% of you, myself included, are taking pictures of random things on the street. And then, once you take those pictures, you basically send them on WhatsApp where they're compressed to near death. And guess what? Your glorious picture turns into total crap. So my question is, if that's what you're going to do with your camera, do you really want to make that the primary reason you upgrade? That's 95% of iPhone's user base and probably all smartphone user base in general. For the 5% of you who truly do utilize the camera system on the iPhone 14 Pro, yes, those raw photos might be of great benefit. And keep in mind, if you're just talking raw technical specifications, phones like the Samsung Ultra S23 are already well ahead. They can do 8K recording, they have 100 times digital zoom, and they have a 200 megapixel sensor as their primary lens, which is a far superior camera in terms of raw technical specifications. But the iPhone's camera system works because it's so smooth. The app is smooth, it's fluid, but guess what? It's fluid across your iPhone 13 Pro, 12 Pro, heck, even your iPhone 11. Do not make that the single reason you want to upgrade your iPhone, as even as a tech reviewer, I hardly use my iPhone for professional reasons, though I will say, if you are in production like me, it can sometimes be a lifesaver as a last resort B-roll camera, which I have to admit has been the case a few times. On the other side of the coin, I will say that a lot of the cool things about the camera come from a software perspective. For example, action mode can further help stabilize an image, though granted I've never really had to use it because the built-in OIS with the iPhone lenses are so darn good. And also there's cinematic mode, which again gives the ability for a 12-year-old child named Tommy to produce some top-notch amateur footage in a cinematic situation, even though they know absolutely nothing about videography or cameras in general. And that's where Apple really excels. They can take these complicated things and simplify it to such an extent that anyone can use these functions in a perfect fashion. And that to me speaks volumes. Battery life. Yeah, let's talk about that one. I think this is a two-part problem. The fact is, I find myself around 30% battery by 6 p.m. far too often for my liking. And I think this is a problem a lot of YouTubers have mentioned. The battery life on the iPhone 14 Pro just is not all-day material, especially when compared to a lot of the competition. Part of the problem is that you have a minuscule 3200 milliamp hour battery, which just isn't enough in my opinion. And then iOS 16 is quite taxing. You have a lot of background functions going on that really tax the battery hard. And with the Pro Max, it's a little bit better thanks to that considerably larger 4300 milliamp hour battery. But I think it's time that Apple realizes that optimizations alone are not enough, and we just need significantly larger batteries. And the worst part is we're still capped at 30-watt fast charging, where a lot of the competition has gone well above that number. So we can't even charge our phones as fast as other phones. So there's a lot here that needs to be compensated for. I think the best solution is to add bigger batteries in future iPhones. While the iPhone 14 Pro has a great deal of other features, the two I want to specifically mention, firstly, the speakers on this phone are so darn good. Granted, they're no longer the loudest speakers out there, but they're still, in my opinion, the most clearest, crisp, and distortion-free speakers you have on a smartphone in 2023, period. I take everything from audio calls to even using them to listen to music when there's no Bluetooth speakers around, and they do all those jobs in such a graceful manner. Now, the second feature I want to mention, or more so remark actually, is the build quality of the iPhone 14 Pro. That stainless steel band with that frosted glass with those metal rings around those lenses to that beautiful ceramic display. It all comes together in such a nice way. And objectively speaking, this is probably the highest materials we've seen on a mainstream phone. It's more superior than the aluminum frame the S23 Ultra uses and just is a level above. Though of course an argument can be made of whether or not this is the prettiest phone in 2023. I think there are far better looking phones if we're talking from a holistic point of view, but that's going to come down to personal preference anyway. I'm sure some of you are itching right now to give your opinion on my review and just your thoughts in general about the iPhone 14 Pro, and I'm here all for it. Let me know what you think of the iPhone 14 Pro. Hopefully, my long-term review gives you some realistic insight as to what you can expect with this phone and what actually counts. So if you are getting the iPhone 14 Pro, let me know in the comment section below. I'm super excited to see what your thoughts are on it. Thanks again for watching. If you enjoyed the content, please consider subbing to this channel. It genuinely helps me grow. Catch you in the next one.